Well, good morning. I'd just like to begin by saying thank you to all of the organizers, Gabriela, Connor, Camilo, Ernesto. It's really great to be back in El Paso and also to be convening on such an important and under-researched topic, as we've already kind of hinted at this morning. So my name is Caitlyn Yates, and I conducted this research in collaboration with my colleague, Stephanie Leutert, who is unfortunately not able to be here today, so I'll be presenting on behalf of both of us. In this project, what we really set out to do is understand migrant kidnapping at the broadest level possible within Mexico, specifically focusing on the regional differences or the regional dynamics under which migrant kidnapping is occurring. So I'll begin by kind of explaining the context under which we began this project. We use a very kind of legal definition throughout, and that's because we both approach a lot of our research through a policy lens, and so I apologize that there won't be entirely kind of academic approaches in a lot of what I say here. But the way in which we define migrant kidnapping or kidnapping in general is through Article 366 of Mexico's Federal Penal Code, and it basically lays out three conditions under which kidnapping must take place. The first is that it must occur through violence or deceit, in either case being accepted as the first condition. The second is that migrants or individuals who are kidnapped are unable to leave the situation. They are being held against their will. And the third condition is incredibly broad. It says that there must be an additional reason. But in the case of a lot of the research that we conducted and the reasons under which we understood migrant kidnapping to be taking place, this was usually for financial or material gain. So when we set out to try and understand what had been done on migrant kidnapping in Mexico, specifically at the kind of the broadest levels possible, we found that really there had been virtually no national level analysis, with the exception of three kind of cases. The first is that, or the first group of these occurred through Mexico's National Commission on Human Rights. There were two reports that were conducted in 2010 and 2011 that interviewed migrants in migrant shelters about their experiences. And based on kind of the interviews and the way in which the report was written, they estimate that anywhere between 20 and 40,000 migrants were being kidnapped every year during that time of individuals who were in transit through Mexico. Another estimate that was written through COLEF data, but by Jeremy Slack, was in 2016, which found that approximately 7% of migrants who had been, Mexican migrants who had been deported, had been kidnapped during their transits. And so what you can see on this map here, and I'll get to the methodology in the next slide, is that we were able to identify migrant kidnapping happening in 22 of Mexico's 32 states over the range of the years that we analyzed, which was 2006 through April of 2018. How are we going to try and understand these regional differences? Well, with the recognition starting up front that very, very few migrants are going to report their crimes, specifically crimes like kidnapping, we still wanted to understand what kind of data the Mexican government had. And so first we began by understanding how migrant kidnapping was categorized and how it was collected in Mexico at the federal level. And while there is a database that looks at all kidnapping, there is not a database that looks specifically at individuals based on their country of origin or their migratory status. So to augment that, we sent transparency requests to Mexico's migration agency, the National Migration Institute, the Federal Attorney General's Office, two specialized units within that Attorney General's Office, and each of the 32 state Attorney General's offices on every migrant kidnapping incident that had been reported to them or that had reached conclusion between 2006 and April 2018. After all of that, we were returned with 159 cases, which if you think about the number of migrants who may or may not be kidnapped every year, that's incredibly low, but we weren't ultimately that surprised based on a host of factors, including a low level of individuals reporting. So to supplement that, the only place that we could really think that this may or may not be reported is through open source and specifically news reporting. And so what we did is we used first a kind of Mexican newspaper repository known as Info Latina, which consolidates most of the federal or the national and state level newspapers using keyword searches to try and look up incidents of migrant kidnapping, and specifically incidences where authorities would have intervened. And then we augmented that with just Google searches with the local and state newspapers throughout Mexico over the same time period, and then created this additional database that intended and did successfully have kind of 42 indicators under which we were trying to understand the dynamics themselves. And so then we combine the two sources. There are several limitations to this data, and I'm happy to discuss all of that thoroughly if that interests you, but this was just trying to understand at the broadest level kind of what the dynamics are, and so we thought that this was an appropriate way to do so. We cross-referenced that none of the cases themselves were duplicated, and somewhat surprisingly, none of them were between what the federal and state institutions had and the newspapers had. And then we began our analysis. We supplemented that with 22 testimonies, trying to understand 22 testimonies from migrants who had previously been kidnapped in those reports that I alluded to earlier, to understand kind of the range of instances and dynamics under which migrant kidnapping is taking place. And so to try and understand the broadest level of what this looks like on the ground and who are the individuals who are perpetrating these crimes, we broke this into 4 regions, and I will go through each of them very briefly now. So the first is the southern border region in Mexico. For us, it comprised the states of Chiapas, Tabasco, and Oaxaca, and 16.2% of the 388 cases occurred in this area. I'll go through 4 kind of dynamics in each of the case study, or each of the region studies. The first is that almost every single migrant incident that listed the way in which migrants were transiting on the train specifically. And so either they were identified while riding on the train or while they were stopped at rest points along the way. These were relatively small kidnapping rings in general, both defined as the number of individuals who were being held at one time and the number of perpetrators who were detained when the stash houses were raided. And then for the majority or the most common nationality of these individuals in transit were Honduran nationals, which was not all that surprising to us because we know that the most common country of origin for migrants in transit through Mexico are from Honduras, at least right now. And what was interesting, or perhaps not so interesting to us, is that also there was a very limited kind of mention in the articles themselves of organized criminal activity in the South. And this differs from other regions, and I'll discuss that later, but what we mean by organized criminal activity, at least for the purpose of the report that we wrote, were specifically large criminal organizations like the Zetas, like the Sinaloa cartel, like the Gulf cartel, not specifically localized gangs or other types of perhaps organized but not entirely national or transnational organizations. And so just to give an example of what this looked like, and this was not a case where migrants were riding on the train, but in a bus, in 2009, there was a case when 19 migrants were riding on a bus in the state of Tabasco when they were stopped at a highway checkpoint a highway checkpoint by municipal police. At that point, the police boarded the bus and asked for identification documents. These 19 migrants did not have the proper documents to continue their transit, and so they were taken back to the police station where they were held against their will. The police officers requested a ransom of approximately $160 per person for these individuals. But one of the individuals riding on the bus had reported to the federal police this incident, and the federal police then raided the police station and ultimately arrested all 21 of the individuals working in that municipal police station. So this kind of shows that it's not necessarily organized in the organized criminal sense of this, but that the organized in this sense came from the highway checkpoint leading to the kidnapping of these individuals and being held in a state or local institution. The second region that we identified is the northeast border region, and for us this comprises the states of Veracruz, Tamaulipas, and Coahuila, very clearly recognizing that that Veracruz is not necessarily a border state, but the dynamics under which these kidnappings were happening in Veracruz so closely mirrored those in Coahuila and Tamaulipas that we included the state. We did not include Nuevo León only because we didn't have enough cases to really be able to say something stark about the dynamics. So of the 388 cases that we saw here, 205 of them occurred in these 3 states. And even more specific, 19% of them occurred in one city, and that's the city of Reynosa, over the course of this time period. In every case, at least in the state of Tamaulipas, the migrants were transiting on bus when they were apprehended, either by authorities or by organized criminal actors. These were by far the largest kidnapping rings, at times including stash houses holding more than 100 migrants. And once more, these were the most common nationality were Honduran migrants. Here we saw the most prevalent level of organized criminal activity, and specifically between the Zetas and the Gulf Cartel, when newspaper articles listed who the actors were. And so I'll just give kind of one example that illuminates more or less why Veracruz was included in this categorization. And so it's an example of a woman who was operating in the city of Coatzacoalcos in the state of Veracruz. And this happened in 2009. This was a woman who ran a shelter, and so it's a somewhat famous case, who ran a shelter just outside of the train stop in Coatzacoalcos. And she would lure migrants in, saying that she was a religious woman who had this shelter. And when migrants would then come back and stay in the shelter, she was working with the Zetas. She would call the Zetas. They would come in trucks, and they would take the migrants all the way up to the north of Tamaulipas, in the corner here, and hold them for ransom until she was eventually caught in 2010. And so this kind of explains why we included Veracruz in the incident, but it also explains why some of the kidnapping rings are larger, because migrants were being brought in on multiple occasions into the same stash house. The third region that we looked at is the northwest border region. For us, this included the states of Baja California and Sonora. We, again, did not include Chihuahua because we did not have, the third state there, we did not have enough cases to be able to make a larger assessment of what was happening. In this scenario, we found no clear transportation method that migrants were using when they were taken by actors. In some cases, they were attempting to cross into the United States. Other times, they were riding on buses, on the train, or just waiting in municipalities, large municipalities, usually like Mexicali or Tijuana in the state of Baja California. These were by far the smallest kidnapping rings. In many cases, it only included 1 or 2 individuals who were being held at a time, which differs starkly from what we see in the Northeast region. And somewhat surprisingly, but definitely what differs here, is that the most common nationality of individuals who were being held in these scenarios were of Mexican origin. And specifically, or in general, they were from the central Mexican states of Guerrero and Michoacan. These were individuals in general who were attempting to enter the United States, just like in the other regions, but mainly Mexicans here. What surprised us most in this research is that we saw virtually no evidence of organized criminal activity with regards to these migrant kidnapping incidents here. In general, these were individuals who were operating on their own, and usually in an attempt to offer fake smuggling services. So I'll give one example that we look at, and it's a family from the state of Guerrero who lived in Tecate, which is a city in the center, small town in the city, in the center part of Baja California, on the border. So this family was originally from Guerrero. They had lived in Baja California for years, and it was 3 siblings and a cousin who were operating this kidnapping ring. And in this scenario, what they would do is they would specifically look for other migrants from the state of Guerrero who were attempting to enter the United States. They would offer fake smuggling services. And from that point, this family would then hold the migrants against their will and request a ransom payment. Eventually, this family was actually caught because somebody recognized their voice when they made a ransom call in the state of Guerrero, and this ring was eventually kind of disrupted. But the kind of localized and very unorganized, I would argue, sense of migrant kidnapping here really differs starkly from the Northeast region, despite both regions having a large organized criminal presence in these areas. The last sector or region that we looked at only had 6 cases, and perhaps that's not enough to really make a large statement, but for us it did, and I'll explain why now. It's the Yucatan Peninsula, specifically Quintana Roo, and even more specifically, exclusively the city of Cancun. So of these 6 cases, in every case, migrants were transiting on foot, and more or less they had the same average size kidnapping rings based on the number of individuals detained and the number of individuals who were being held against their will. What it differed starkly here is that in every case, every single migrant apprehended was of Cuban origin, and these were individuals who were coming either, in one case, by raft, although none of the other news articles explained how these migrants had arrived here, so we're not exactly sure on that side. But this was specifically Cuban nationals, and again, we saw no evidence of organized criminal activity. Rather, these were individuals who were either offering fake smuggling services or who were able to apprehend migrants for other reasons. And so that's more or less what it looked like, so I won't really offer an example there because that's how it worked in all 6 cases. So just 3 points I want to hit on here in terms of looking at the differences in the regions. The first is that by far the most prevalent area that we identified migrant kidnapping incidents is occurring is in the Northeast region. And this is explained for a couple of reasons, but one that we argue in the report is that this is the sector where the majority or most migrants are transiting through, right? It's the most prevalent region, and therefore it's reasonable to assume that there would be more migrant kidnapping on average, although the proportional level is not as drastic as it looks there. The second point that I would hit on here is that in the Northwest region, in the sector with Baja California and Sonora, these were by far the smallest kidnapping incidents by a medium number of victims. And so this really kind of alludes to the fact that this is less organized, that there is likely no, or at least limited mentions or existence of organized criminal activity in the highly organized sense of the word. And then the last type that was kind of surprising to us is that the median ransom on average was more or less the same, with the exception of the Yucatan Peninsula, where the Cuban nationals were being kidnapped. We don't really have an explanation as to why that is, but that's certainly something to kind of delve into deeper going forward. So with that, I'll just conclude with a couple of thoughts and some of the conclusions that we made in the report itself. The first is that migrant kidnapping incidents do follow, at least in our analysis, common migrant routes or paths throughout Mexico. And this wasn't necessarily surprising, but that we were able to kind of show that with the data that we found. The second, though, is that they do not present the same modus operandi or the same dynamics throughout all of Mexico. And this was something, specifically when thinking about organized criminal actors or state actors, was really important for us to highlight. And so ultimately what I'll argue here with relation to the topic of this workshop is that this should be understood as a crime of immobility, both in the sense that individuals are being violently or forced into the situation, and also that migrants are entering into the situation under the guise of other reasons, including the offer of fake smuggling services, though that wasn't necessarily something that happened on a significant or kind of majority basis. But this should also be understood as a crime of opportunity. We really didn't see lots of kind of high-level organized criminal activity in the sense of criminal actors attempting to kind of make a monopoly or take a monopoly on this criminal activity, which differs from, say, the trafficking in arms or the trafficking of drugs, right? There was no attempt to hold a space in that sense. And this is really kind of demonstrated most clearly by the number and the type of actors that were operating within this sphere, and that there isn't this kind of same plaza or turf or control battle that you see in other crimes, specifically high-impact crimes. And so I will stop there, but I'm happy to discuss this further in the discussion section.